Our next presenter will tell us how brands and retailers must structure plans post-crisis. He is David Gottlieb, Managing Director, Americas for Trax. David, the podium is yours.
All right, great. Thank you, John. Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining today, and thanks to CPG Matters for having me on to talk a bit about the industry and about some of the ways that we see opportunities to respond to the pandemic and to this kind of new normal. My name is David Gottlieb. I lead the business for Trax here in the Americas region. So, what is Trax? Trax is a roughly 10-year-old company. We're based in Singapore, and we're one of the leading artificial intelligence or AI platforms for the retail and CPG industry. And we really built our core business around applying artificial intelligence to computer vision or image recognition, specifically suited for the fast-moving consumer goods space. And we've been very fortunate to achieve global scale, operating in over 90 countries today, and doing business with many of the top players in the space, both on the manufacturer side as well as on the retail side. We've grown both organically with a lot of internal investment and innovation, as well as through some pretty focused acquisitions over the past 2 or 3 years. And those have given us access to new technology and markets, but also some new and differentiated capabilities that kind of round out our offering. In particular, a recent acquisition of Survey.com, which gave us an in-store merchandising capability powered by data and by computer vision that now has us merchandising in roughly 85,000 doors a month here in the U.S. So that's just a bit about the company. So given where we play in the industry, we've got some perspective to share on the space, based on what we're doing with our customers today. And while the title of the presentation might almost be a bit cliche or cringy, everyone's talking about the new normal and how everything is changing, but there's still something to talk about here. I mean, there's still a reality that we're all dealing with. And there's a lot of unknowns out there. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't have any way to look into the future better than anybody else does. But what I do want to do in the next few minutes here is just talk a bit about some of the very practical things that we see as some key focus areas, both for retailers and for consumer goods companies, as everybody's looking to put themselves in a position to win and to be successful in the coming months and years, looking at it through the lens of all this uncertainty. So five topics I'm going to talk about. I'm going to hit them one at a time. First, we have to really consider that everything we understood in the past and all the learnings that we had about shopper behavior and path to purchase are really worth looking at again and looking at from the ground up. There's a study that McKinsey did, and this slide talks about some of the key findings. What was super interesting here to me is if you look at the U.S. line, and they surveyed a bunch of shoppers, and what they found was in the U.S., 75% of the people they spoke with indicated that they've changed their normal shopping approach in some way. And this means they're trying new channels, new retailers. They're trying new ways of buying, like e-commerce or buy online, pick up in store. And they're switching brands. So everything we knew in the past about what a loyal shopper is and what a loyal consumer looks like is really being questioned right now. And I think it's easy to chalk up some of that 75% of people as being in a bucket that you would say, well, they're making sort of choices that are really not their own because choices have become limited with the pandemic, and they're being forced into these changes in behavior. What was even more interesting, though, is in that same study, when they talked to that 75% of the population or of the surveyed group in the U.S., at least 4/5 of them intended to maintain some of the things they've trialed during this period. So, the industry's always been built on this notion of try and rebuy, and here what we're seeing is shoppers maybe try things by, not so much by choice, but by need, but as they do so, they find things that they like, and those things are going to make their way into the way that they shop in the future, the brands that they show preference for, and the retailers that they choose to visit. So, super interesting. Second, we all have to look even more holistically at how we measure the business from a data standpoint. And data has always been, or long been, the fuel of the industry to a degree. It's really more critical than ever that players aren't looking through the business, looking at it through too narrow of a lens. For example, if you look at it from a manufacturer's perspective, if you look at the business just in terms of market share or percent ACV for your brand, you may not be understanding the real interaction between shopper and category at the store level. You may not understand the impact of in-store experience, the impact of out-of-stocks, the impact of where you are on the shelf. All those things are really critical to get a more complete understanding of how shoppers are buying and why they're buying. And as retailers are increasingly looking to simplify assortments, we're hearing this a lot lately. I'm sure people on the phone would be nodding their heads if I could see them. This is a solid theme in the industry. There's a lot of a squeeze going on, or a potential squeeze on manufacturer portfolios. So if you imagine a scenario where a retailer is looking at the sales data for an item and maybe even considering delisting it because the overall sales contribution isn't where they want it to be, that's a conclusion that sales data can lead you to, and it may be the wrong conclusion. And what I mean by that is if you're not looking at in-store data, such as, for example, availability on the shelf, the rate of out-of-stock for that item, there's a bigger story here that maybe will reveal itself. So imagine if the manufacturer has shelf data showing that actually the item in question is relatively consistently out of stock. Maybe the availability is in the 70s or 80s versus like the high 90s where they want it to be. If they combine that with the sales data, the conclusion you might come to is almost the exact opposite, right? You might say, you know what, this item is a great item. The shoppers really want it. In fact, the shelf can't keep up. There's not enough holding power to keep up with shopper demand. So we really ought to be looking at how do we increase space for this item, or reset the shelf minimum, or think about other supply chain changes, because at the end of the day, this thing is a winner and we're just not giving it a chance to be successful. So looking at data across those dimensions in combination, I think is really critical as some of these decisions are going to be made over the next weeks and months about assortment simplification and SKU rationalization. The next piece is the store itself, and the store has become a bit more fluid. Shoppers are now, as I mentioned earlier, choosing different routes to get to products. So they're buying online, maybe they're getting products delivered, picking up curbside. That changes the relationship to a degree between the shopper and the store, right? So if they're buying online, how does that online experience need to be adjusted to make sure we're engaging them with the right way? How do we make sure we're not allowing them to order things online that are not available in the store? And that level of disappointment that gets generated when a shopper makes that, goes through all the steps to create an order, go to the store and go to pick it up and find that, some percentage of the items were not able to be fulfilled, that's something that retailers really can't afford to have given this competitive environment. And when they do make the hard decision to pack up the kids and get to the store, how do we make sure that experience is as positive as it can be? And some of the ways that we can do that are helping manufacturers create kind of a hyper-localization strategy. So how do they think about each store, each zone as its own business, and make sure they understand the needs of the shoppers in those markets so that they can actually drive consumers to choose products on every shelf in the store? Creating a strategy that includes a feedback loop from the shelf all the way to the head office can really help manufacturers, CPG companies, develop the optimal buying conditions in each outlet. And with that feedback, they can make decisions on assortment and what products are going to sell well in each market, how they might configure the planogram differently, which items might deserve more space and which ones actually maybe don't play as well. And that really has to fit into this kind of overall theme of retailers asking for perhaps reduced customer choice and streamlined assortments as they try to simplify supply chains for this foreseeable future. Very much related to the shifting demand patterns that are influenced by this type of shopper engagement change, inventory at the shelf is super critical. And I talked about a minute ago, for example, the connection between the online shopping experience and on-hand inventory in the store. Brands and retailers really need to work together to refine store-level planning taking into account not only this shifting of shopper demand and a little bit less predictable shopper demand, given the mix of e-commerce and in-store consumption, but also the really significant constraints on the supply chain that continue to persist. A great example of this is, it's been talked about quite a bit, but there's been a recent shortage in some raw materials in a bunch of different categories, but in particular in aluminum cans. A lot of this is driven by shoppers not being able to go to restaurants, and so we see a shift kind of in the inverse of what we maybe saw as a trend previously, where restaurant volume is shifting back into grocery stores. And as a result of that, if you think about, for example, carbonated soft drinks, all the volume that maybe was coming out of fountains 6 months ago has shifted back to the store. And so this is really driving the need for manufacturers to simplify. So if you're manufacturing 12 flavors of sparkling water, you might look at that and say, okay, I can only supply X amount of product to the store. How do I rationalize the flavors such that I can supply the ones that are most in demand and service the majority of the shopper need versus maybe perhaps having that full complement of flavors? And so we're seeing that take place really across the industry. Now, as part of that, I think smarter companies will focus on how can they manage inventory at the shelf instead of just looking at it from sort of a manufacturer to DC perspective. And with people making fewer visits to the stores, it's super critical that when the products, when they show up at the store, they make that visit, the products that they're looking for are on the shelf. We've already talked about how brand switching and retailer switching can contribute to longer-term impacts on brand loyalty and on overall kind of sales volume. And so to the extent that we can avoid that, if you have a loyal customer, it's really key that when they come into the store, they can find a product. Traditionally, and the industry has spent a lot of money on trying to solve essentially shelf replenishment or shelf inventory planning by using just scan data, right? Scan in, scan out data. And that method works reasonably well in a normal buying environment, although we would argue it's always had some degree of sort of last mile challenge, meaning that the industry hasn't really been able to solve the out-of-stock problem better than sort of high single digits in most fast-moving categories. This sort of capability is challenged even further when it comes to this environment we're in now, where we see shopper behavior not only changing, but changing quickly and being just less predictable than it's ever been before. And so one of the ways in which manufacturers and retailers can work together is to really understand inventory on the shelf, on display, and so really look at it from an observational perspective to measure availability to the shopper in an item's home location or in a secondary location on a near real-time basis. And if you can shift from just looking at sales out and scans to monitoring the shelf at the item level across sort of time on a real-time basis, that can drive a much more proactive inventory strategy. So it can do a couple of things. One is it can make the retailer a bit more agile at replenishing the shelf. So what I mean by that is, rather than walking down aisles looking for out-of-stocks, imagine if a retailer knew at any point in time all of the items in the store that were not available on the shelf, they could then prioritize those out-of-stocks and essentially replenish them based on either the importance to the shopper or the average unit retail, the gross margin contribution, all looked at through a lens of what's actually available in the back room. And then over time, if you think about understanding that shelf dynamic and item velocity, it puts you in a much better position to understand where you might need to make tweaks to things like shelf space. Maybe a single-faced item needs to be double-faced because it just can't keep up with shopper demand. Maybe you need to reset your shelf minimum, et cetera, et cetera. And so all those things in combination can really drive a much more effective strategy for keeping key items in stock at the shelf where the customers can buy them. And the last piece is really coming down to how to think about the right labor model to best service the business and to provide flexibility when dealing with some of this unpredictable demand that we talked about on the previous slide. Whoops, I'm gonna go back to this one. So with so many workers forced to stay at home and big layoffs. A lot of people's job situation have been changing over the last months. This pandemic has caused a huge disruption in the workforce. We see stores reopening, which has been great, and people returning to work. One of the things that retailers can start to think about is how they can reshape the workforce to support the new normal and also have an action plan in place for future disruption. Similarly, CPG companies can reevaluate their strategic store priorities in brand marketing and assortment and space to evolve with customers as shopping behaviors change. And instead of thinking about sort of siloed workforce models for planning and distribution and for merchandising and sales, there's really an opportunity here for companies to think about and rethink the workforce composition. One of the elements that could include, and we talked about this very early in my presentation, is for frontline workers who are performing work like in-store merchandising, data collection, inventory management, and other kind of activation level tasks, including a strategy that may include gig workers, flexible mobile workforce as part of that capability, can really provide not only a surge capacity, but a much more flexible way to execute at the store level and give the retailer and the manufacturer the flexibility to apply those resources where they're needed and when they're needed on a very short-term basis. And that allows you to execute brand tactics rapidly and at scale. And in addition, and this kind of relates to my last point, as part of that workforce model, you can also consider digitizing and automating some of the relatively low value but high cost management activities like shelf audits, like planogram compliance, as well as maintaining and managing shelf tags and IRCs and things like that. So that is the workforce piece. Ultimately, the crisis has escalated the case for taking decisive action to improve retail execution. To really come out of this thing strong, retailers and manufacturers have a big opportunity to focus on customer needs, to redefine the store strategy, enable the right type of workforce with the right level of flexibility, as well as integrate technology to accelerate access to information that can drive sales and ultimately keep product on shelves, making for happier shoppers. So, Trax as a company brings together technology as well as innovative approaches to executing at a store level. This allows retailers and brands to have the kind of agility that's really critical to come out of this pandemic as a growth leader. And I'm not going to make this a Trax commercial. I'm going to build this out. But just to give you a sense of really where we play and what we have to offer, at our core, we have really three basic capabilities. First is, we talked about a bit, computer vision, which is really the basis of our ability to understand what's happening at the shelf in a fast, systematic way. And when we say computer vision, really, I mean, to put it simply, what that means is if you take a photo or somebody takes a photo or a photo is taken of a shelf set, a category, a display, a cooler door, a bunker, it doesn't really matter, any part of the store, we can essentially take that image, which is unstructured data, and identify what's in it down to the UPC. So that's the first bucket. And you can imagine that once you've done that, you can extract lots of super interesting metrics and KPIs from that recognized image. So you can understand where you are on the shelf. You can understand what's missing from the shelf. You can understand your share of shelf by facings or in linear space, all those types of measures. We combine that with our AI analytics. And the analytics really are what allow us to take that base data and generate some practical insights that can be used to drive decision making. And that may be a decision that's made in the field by somebody actually servicing a store, or it may be, like I talked about earlier, decisions that are made upstream in a category management context or shelf planning or headquarters selling. The third leg of that stool is the on-demand workforce, and we call it the flex force. And so if you think about having this sort of powerful technology, the key ingredient then becomes, how do I actually get into the store, understand what's happening, and then use the information both in-store and upstream? And that's exactly what we do with the Flex Force. So this is a flexible mobile workforce. It's kind of crowd-based. It's million shopper strong. And we're able to deploy that force on behalf of brands, manufacturers, and retailers to outlets on an on-demand basis and allow them to essentially help us to quantify the store, so what's happening, use that quantification in real time to then take action at the shelf. And that can be simple things like perhaps I'm low on inventory, I need to pack out the shelf. Perhaps I want to apply IRCs. Maybe I'm even doing a reset. All those types of things can be done at incredible scale and also measured in a way that's super systematic and shows essentially your business, okay, what was the material impact of that store visit? So what was the condition of the shelf beforehand? What was the condition of the shelf after the visit? And how do I think about that from a very numeric kind of ROI perspective? And so our customers use these capabilities sometimes individually and sometimes all together broadly to be able to understand the nature of the store and use that information to help them drive a better shopping experience by activating at scale with our help in the store and also upstream when it comes to how do I build the right category plan, how do I build the right stories when I want to go have a headquarters selling conversation, like my example earlier about the item that was going to be delisted. And so there are examples like that every day where we see manufacturers and retailers having I think much more productive and candid line reviews and joint business planning conversations that are really fueled by this type of insight and data on top of the data that has historically made up the basis for those conversations, which is primarily kind of POS and sales. So that, I believe, is my last slide.
Okay,
and
David, we've had a series of questions, David, that have come in that I will pose to you right now. The first one is sort of a general question. Yeah, it's sort of a general question. How has COVID-19 reshaped supply and demand?
Yeah, I mean, some of these things we talked about. So on the demand side, without going into too much of the sort of obvious, hey, it's hard to find cleaning products and paper towels and things like that. We've seen an interesting shift in the overall demand for certain categories, and one that's super interesting to me that persists today is demand for what I would call the comfort food kind of center store categories has really been significantly larger than historic norms and persists today. And that's why you have products like cookies and crackers that are still on allocation, meaning the manufacturers of those products can't just take all the orders that come in and ship them. They're actually having to allocate the product based on what they believe to be the market need, by zone, by retailer, et cetera. So demand continues to be higher than normal in a bunch of categories. And then from a store perspective, demand is less predictable in terms of kind of day part, day of week. Because people have changed the way in which they're shopping, that demand is less consistent than it was before. So I think those are some of the drivers. And then we talked about also demand from a retail, grocery perspective being further kind of amplified by the fact that in many markets, certainly in where I am in Colorado, many people are not going to restaurants, and so all of that consumption has pushed primarily back to the grocery store. And that's created a bunch of supply issues, like we talked about the aluminum cans. There have been protein supply issues, and some of that is maybe temporary. If you think about the toilet tissue example, that's another one where you have people shifting from offices to homes, right? People aren't going to the office, and manufacturers, have really two fundamentally different product families, and it's not trivial for them to switch over overnight from manufacturing commercial toilet tissue to domestic toilet tissue. And so some of those things just take time to adjust, and I think each manufacturer is having to look at the situation and make hard choices about how long is this going to persist and how long is this going to be the new normal as they look to make decisions about, adjusting product supply for some of those dynamics.
Okay, very good. Here's a very specific question that came in. Why should on-the-shelf inventory management be a greater focus than the back room or warehouse? And how has COVID-19 played a part in this shift?
Sure. So if we're talking about traditional cash and carry retail, I would say the reason the shelf is critical is really straightforward. It's because that's where the shoppers experience the brand, and that's where the shoppers experience trying to fill the items on their shopping list in the store. And so, historically, if you think about the way that retail has been managed, the tendency is to kind of level up in the location hierarchy and level up in the supply chain. So if I plan my DC inventory properly, I should be in a good position to service the store. The problem is the devil's in the detail, and there's often a disconnect between the shopper at the shelf and the product actually getting to the shelf in a timely way. So you have backroom inventory issues, you have intraday shelf replenishment issues, you have spikes like we talked about in demand at the store level that can really hurt a retailer's ability to keep items in stock and available for the shopper.
Okay, David. Let me see. Next question that came in. How quick is the process in its entirety from the second a shelf picture is taken to the moment the shelf is restocked? That's an interesting question.
Yeah, I'll answer that in two ways. So what's interesting about that is because we've instrumented retail stores in some cases with our physical infrastructure. So we have a couple different business models, but one of them when we partner with retailers is to actually take fixed shelf edge cameras or robots or other technology and put them in the store. And the interesting thing about the fixed shelf edge cameras is unlike capturing, let's say, a category with a mobile device, you're in a position to capture information and images of the category nearly all the time. So whether it's every 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 1 hour, you're getting a longitudinal or time-based view of the category. And some of the A/B testing we've done, which is I think it maybe answers the question, is if you sort of do nothing, if you let things run the way they are, meaning if we set up a camera and we capture the shelf and we quantify that image, but we don't alert the store associate, so we don't change the business process, the way of working, we saw that shelf outs or out of stocks persisted for sometimes multiple days, right? 2-3 days. Now that's not terribly surprising if you imagine that for some items the inventory may not be in the back room and it has to come in on the next delivery or has to be reordered. But for some of those items they were in the back room. And the way we know that is as we looked at the B side of the test, right, not the control group but the test group, we saw the average out of stock in that same category shrinking significantly down to about 2 hours. And so the answer to the question is it can shrink significantly. The only real limitation here is more from an operational standpoint on the retailer to say, look, how often do you really want to accumulate these alerts and make them available to your team, knowing that their only job is not replenishing the shelf, they've got to service customers and be managing the store, et cetera. So it can be as frequently as you like, but I think in a practical sense, we've seen reductions of out-of-stock duration in that sort of order of magnitude that I described.
Okay, excellent. Our final question is, how can you benefit companies that are struggling with shelf inventory due to COVID-19?
I think the best answer, so we can't fix the supply chain, candidly, right? That's sort of out of our control. What we are seeing is a need, and many of the customers that we work with, if they are in that short supply model, right? So they're saying, look, we can't produce enough, whatever reason our product supply isn't enough to fill all the orders. What we're helping those companies with is understanding what the true state is of the store. And by doing that, helping them build a little bit of a smarter prioritization model. So instead of just taking the orders as they come in, first come, first serve, imagine if the person who asked that question understood that, hey, you know what? In the Northeast, within the Ahold stores in the Northeast, your availability is nowhere near what it is in Publix in the Southeast. If you knew that, say on a weekly or monthly basis, it could inform how you think about making those allocation decisions and ultimately spread the inventory as equitably as possible, but also meeting as much shopper demand as possible. So I'd say that's probably the best thing that we're doing for companies who are in that shelf inventory, constrained inventory position.
Okay, great. Well, that finishes our questions. I want to thank you, David. That was excellent. And For those people who want to reach out to David for more information, you can contact him at the email address which is on the screen right now, david.gottlieb@traxretail.com. Thank you, David. That was excellent.
Great. Thanks so much. I appreciate it, John.